introduce her very, very briefly, so we'll do so. She's a gynecologist with a master's in international health at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she joined Scienzano in 2019.
Yes.
There you go.
Just prior to the COVID pandemic, great timing. Thank you for sticking with me and still being here on the last session of the second day. Congratulations for your stamina. I'll probably make a few points that have already been made, so I apologize in advance. But I'm hoping it might be useful as a sort of a case study from a small European country, because there's been a lot of talk about Israel and the UK, and maybe it's useful to see how it is in the day-to-day life for some of those smaller countries. So first, very briefly, I want to make the point, kind of, if we're talking about real-world evidence, what kind of data are we talking about? What is there? I think the point has been made yesterday that spontaneous reporting, for instance, is also real-world evidence, so we should look at it broad enough. So what do we do at the epidemiology department of Scienzano, which is our National Institute of Public Health, and then how is that data used, hopefully? What are the challenges, and trying to end on a silver lining. So the obvious, I think, type of data that comes to mind is the incidence data. But even there's tons of sources that can be used, and I think maybe of the lesser known or lesser used one is actually patients reporting. So we've got a website where patients can report whether they have respiratory symptoms. We also have one where they can report whether they've had a tick bite. There's, of course, all kinds of data that comes from primary care. That's especially useful if it's clinically very distinctive symptoms or syndromes, like for mumps or varicella or zoster. I think those networks are also extremely useful to confirm absence of a certain disease, like we have the measles elimination goals. So there it's useful if clinicians tell us every month that they haven't seen any measles cases. That way we are sure that we're not missing too many cases. There's, of course, the lab data that can be either sentinel reporting or national reference centers. So that's a network of specialized labs that survey one pathogen and that have a certain expertise. All sorts of hospital data, either extracted from automated coding or more manually input, for instance, for the SARI surveillance, the severe acute respiratory infections. Huge administrative databases, that's probably where all of us are looking at mostly, like how can we capitalize on those and use those. But also things like environmental surveillance, which I think is a bit of a new buzzword now. It's mostly about detecting infectious agents in wastewater. But there's also the important information about things like just temperature and air pollution that should go into certain estimations. Incidence data is one thing, but we sometimes need more detailed genomic surveillance data. So that's where our NRCs come in and who do the more profound microbiological surveillance and genotyping. As we know with COVID-19, but with many different diseases, it's not just about the incidence, but also about the susceptible population who is potentially at risk for a certain disease. And there, the seroprevalence studies can offer a lot of important information. And vaccination coverage. It's been mentioned many times. And Belgium being a very complex federated country, there's different systems for different vaccinations. Hélène already mentioned it. But that also means that if we try to collate vaccination coverage data, it depends whether we're looking at routine infant immunizations or adult immunizations. For adult immunizations, for instance, Scienzano does a health information survey, which is a periodical survey where they go out and ask people about loads of their health behaviors. And one of the things is also whether they've had a flu shot or not. And then for COVID-19, we have a wonderful national vaccine register being set up that allowed us much more granular data on vaccination coverage than we've ever had for any other disease. And that was obviously very nice. For politicians and policymaking, burden of disease is also important. So we've got some colleagues working on the cause-specific death certificates and then translating those in years of life lost. And with any health intervention, it will only be useful if there is sufficient uptake. And so I think this is a field where there's probably not enough from our side being invested in. But we had some examples with the COVID crisis where they actually had citizen panels and asked them about their attitudes and beliefs about, for instance, COVID vaccinations, what would prompt them to take it, not to take it. And that can then inform communication campaigns, but also what you need to monitor. And again, in these periodical health information surveys that are being conducted by Cienzano, people are asked about preventive behaviors and how they feel about certain interventions. So how is this used in real life and not for COVID vaccinations? Because we've talked a lot about that. I think one really nice example was the PCV vaccination. It's included in the routine infants immunization program in Belgium, but every 4 years there's a new tender that is launched. And then it's, among others, obviously the price that determines which vaccine makes it into the program. And so there was an initial shift from PCV10 to PCV13, but then back to PCV10. Only we noted in the genomic surveillance data done by the National Reference Center that this switch went along with a steep increase in IPD cases caused by serotype 19A, and that then prompted us to switch back to the higher valent vaccine. The health technology assessments and cost-effectiveness studies are not being done by Cienzano, not by the Public Health Institute, but by a separate entity in Belgium, which is the KCE, which does all of the HTA assessments. But of course, they cannot do these kind of assessments if they lack good incidence data. And so I think the Shingrix example is probably a bit of a controversial one, because I think our Belgian estimates were quite different than some of the other countries. And I don't think that the differences are due to the incidence data, but it's of course an important factor. We've studied time and time again, collaboration is important, and even though we like to have local data and being able to adapt decisions to the local epidemiology, it's important to contribute to European collaborations, which we of course do. So what are the challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis? I think a very big one is timeliness. I've talked about the administrative databases, and these potentially really have tons of information. There's cause-specific mortality, there's reimbursement of healthcare use, and reimbursement of vaccines as well. But most of those data sets in Belgium come with a delay of 2 years. That's obviously not very handy. It has to do with the way the reimbursement system works, the invoicing of the hospitals, but also if you go to a primary care practitioner, you pay quite a lot upfront, then you get a slip. And if you hand in that slip to your insurer, then you're reimbursed. But you have 2 years to hand in that slip, so they only get the data after 2 years. Fortunately, there is more and more a move towards doing all of that electronically and to not pay the full amount upfront, but only pay your patient part of it. So I'm hopeful that there will be some improvements, but at the time being, this is really a very big barrier. Harmonization, the importance of having correct definitions, using the right case definitions, using the same coding language. And for instance, in our Sentinel Lab network, because this is a voluntary network, we want to have as many labs on board as possible. And so we tell them, like, yeah, send them whichever data you have. Just export it from your system and send it to us. And then we need to go through the entire exercise of trying to put all of that different outputs in our language and make it into a harmonized unity. And unfortunately, they change their systems and they change their outputs. So this is a continuous effort, which is not always very sustainable. So there as well, we're trying to make it more harmonized, to give them an upfront payment to actually get their output in our required format, and then put it in our systems like that, but so that the translation, if you want, from different coding systems, etc., is on their side. We'll see how well that would work and how our coverage of the Sentinel networks responds to it. There's the linkage of data. Again, there's been a lot of talk about linking data, and potentially it's so powerful. And I'll give you the example of what we have in Belgium as data sets and as data. And this is a project of some of my colleagues who want to look at the impact of COVID, especially with regards to social inequalities. And we've got a lot of data that could help us to answer those questions, because we have all the testing data on COVID that was required. Every COVID test needed to be reported to the national level, so we have all of that. We have a lot of information about COVID hospitalization as well in a special COVID database. There's another database, the reimbursement database, where there's all the information on healthcare use and healthcare reimbursement. And then there is it's another database that has all the information on you as a taxpayer. So it will have, it knows how much what's the household income, what's the household composition, etc. And the good thing is there's a unique identifier that can link all of those data sets together. So in theory, it's a wonderful exercise and it's definitely feasible. In practice, our privacy organization doesn't like it that much. And so there's been a lot of back and forth around this project. There's been a lot of technical discussions about things like tokenization and encrypting, decrypting, re-encrypting, splitting up the whole data set in separate sub-data sets to answer separate research questions, etc. So we'll get there. But the issue is that this was actually a project for which funding was available from the federal level. It responded to a need that our government said, like, hey, it would be interesting to know so that we can learn lessons and do better next time. By the time the back and forth with the privacy, well, information security committee, as we call it, by the time that was done and the approval was actually granted, it was 1.5 years later, which is not great if you've got a certain amount of funding, or if this is supposed to be your PhD project. And the issue is not just that it takes a lot of time in itself, but it's that it's unpredictable. Because you're not, I mean, if you know that you'll get there after 1.5 years, you're probably willing to still do the effort. But it's a bit unclear whether in the end you're going to get it. So how much effort are you going to continue to invest in actually getting it? And it took 1.5 years to get the approval. I think the technical infrastructure is actually still being built, so there will be at least 3 years in by the time they can actually start the analysis. Vaccination status, a lot, again, has been said. And I'm not quite sure whether I need to be comforted or rather disappointed that even in the UK, where they did a lot of great studies on the NIMS database, and I think the utility of it has been very clearly proven, that it's not a given that this registry system will be continued. And in Belgium, we were in a very similar situation. Because as I said, there's different vaccination registries that exist in different federated regions. Some of them work well, some of them don't work well. There is lack of a legal framework to actually be allowed to pool of this data together. But all of that has been worked on, and let's hope, even if the decision has clearly been made, that the system for COVID that was put in place and that worked brilliantly They've decided that they will not continue this because it was a federal thing and this is a regional competency, so they want to do their own thing. Sometimes the problem is not even there. It's that the well baby clinics in a substantial part of Belgium, the well baby clinics, who are the major vaccinator for routine infant immunizations, they don't have access to a computer. This is Belgium 2023. So it's not about not having the software, it's not about the softwares not communicating to each other, it's about just not putting that information in any kind of digital records. So it's putting a sticker on a paper. I've been promised that by next year this will be solved. So I'm hoping, and I hope you can all join me in crossing our fingers that this will be resolved. But I think it's a sobering thought, and I think it's something we do need to remind ourselves if we're in these kind of meetings where we're thinking about all the possibilities, etc., that sometimes the day-to-day reality is quite different. And I have to say that I was surprised. I didn't know this. I thought that we would be far more advanced, but apparently we're not. There's a lot of data sets, but it's not always clear where they are. So I'm doing a project currently on group B strep, trying to at least have an idea of what the current situation in Belgium is, so that if a vaccine would become available, we can also evaluate more easily whether to use it, in whom to use it, etc. And there's actually a lot of data, but it's in at least 4 different data sources that are in different regional levels again. And all of these people are willing to collaborate, but it seems to come down a bit to your personal network, whether you know about the existence of these data sets, and whether then you can get people to put them all together. And finally, funding. With COVID, there was, of course, a lot of attention on all this real-world evidence and data and surveillance, and a lot of things have been done, and I think I'm quite proud of what we achieved in Belgium, but it definitely came at a cost. It came at a human resources cost, both from us at the Public Health Institute, but also from the hospitals, who needed to manually put in a lot of data often or do complicated data extractions, etc. And so I think we need to think clearly about what we actually need, like what level of data do we want? Because often in discussions now, it seems that what is possible for COVID needs to be the new standard. It's the new normal, but it might not be very sustainable. And we're currently in the process of discussing with our funders, which is the government, the different governments, on how much they will continue to fund us. But you can already see that there's quite a mismatch in their expectations on the one hand and what they're willing to pay for it on the other hand. That's a bit of a gloom picture, so I'll try to bear in mind the words of Liz earlier. There's a lot of challenges, but like, what are we going to do about it? So trying to end on a positive note, I do really believe that the COVID-19 example worked as a showcase and put the importance of surveillance and good quality surveillance high on the agenda of many people. As I said, in Belgium we have a unique identifier. There's a national register, so everyone who's in Belgium for more than 3 months needs to have this number. So the potential for linkage really is very, very high. There's more and more work on automated data extractions. A lot of the labs, for instance, that weren't doing it previously because they were obliged with COVID to get any sort of reimbursement, they've started to work on it, and so that's ongoing work where I think really can capitalize on the efforts that have been made for COVID. It would definitely help if we, as the Public Health Institute, but also more in general, there was a more clear legal framework. Because public health institutes have different mandates, and I think we come back also to the question of Kaat earlier, like, shouldn't Cienzano then be pushing to have those vaccine registries, etc.? So I think yes, I also try. But if you look at what's our official mandate, it's very vague, and you can read a lot of different things in it, which doesn't make it easy to then play a certain role or another, and also not to then convince, for instance, the data security agencies that we need to have access to that kind of information, etc., and that we have a legal right to it. And that was different in COVID, because there was a lot of extra legislation that was passed because it was a public health emergency, etc. So there was just legally a lot more that was possible. That did also, especially with the vaccination certificates and the getting access to public life if you were vaccinated or if you had a negative test, etc. It did also lead to a lot of questions about privacy and who should have this data, who can have access to this data. I think that there potentially, one of the issues is that all those routinely collected data and real-world evidence, people haven't consented to their data being shared. But then you could, in my view, also take the approach of, well, they also haven't not consented, so let's go for an opt-out system rather than requiring an opt-in. And there, quite helpfully, I think the European health data space is pushing for that as well, and pushing for more secondary use of health data. And even though I'm sometimes a bit surprised when I'm in this meeting and seeing what they're all trying to do, and then how it's in stark contrast with my day-to-day realities. I'm hoping that this can really be a push forward. In Belgium, we will have a Belgian Health Data Authority that should at least try and get rid of this fragmentation or have catalogs of the available data, etc. So I do really think that there's a silver lining and that we're getting there, but it's still a bit of a way. Thank you very much.
Okay, we were exactly on time, but because it's there's only one presentation after, Laurence, we can maybe have a few minutes, like let's say 5 minutes at most for questions. If not, okay, there are questions. Julia?
Hi, thank you for a lovely presentation, and I think the challenges that you've outlined are really familiar to us, even in the UK. You think we've got great data, we've done all these studies, but it has been a battle for us as well over the 20-odd years we've been working on this, especially with the information governance, and I think that is a really big barrier. So it sounds like you're getting there with the linkage studies, and fingers crossed it's going to happen. So if it does happen, do you think that you're going to be able to build on that to then have this legal framework? Because I think that's what really helps us, having this legal framework, which is quite generic. We don't have to go back for each study we have. We're allowed to use personal identifiable information without patient consent to evaluate the vaccine programme. I think that's the wording. It's very generic. So that's really what you need, and then you can waive it. So you're hoping that this will be...
I'm really hoping for that, because I agree. Otherwise, it's just unmanageable. And also for because I was quite critical about our Data Governance Institute, but in their defense, they're massively understaffed. They had tons of demands. It's impossible for them to keep up. And as I said, the legal framework is also quite vague. It's not very clear. I think in European meetings as well, the GDPR is brought up very often, but then GDPR is supposed to be across-the-board European directive, and if you see what in reality is being done or how it's being interpreted, it's very different in different countries. So I am really hoping that there can be, from a European level, a bit more of a push there and a bit more of a clarification maybe of how initially it's been intended, because I've been told, at least by people at the European level, that it was meant to be very clear that there's exceptions for general interest, etc. In Belgium itself, I also think we really just need better Belgian legislation, but this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, I think, because I don't think in our institute we necessarily currently have the mandate to really go propose legislation, and so we're kind of trying to push for it, I think, on the different levels. But the most we can do is raise that this is an issue, and then hope that at the appropriate level they will get together around the table and put this in place. But as I just mentioned, it's made even more complex by the fact that it's not just it's not just the federal government that needs to agree on it, but it's the different regions. So I mean, I don't know whether you know, but during COVID we had like 8 ministers of health that need to get together. We have 11 million inhabitants. So yeah, I think things are a bit more complex than they should be. But voila, we have to work with the situation it is. And I'm hoping I can get some support from the European level, because otherwise I think it might be difficult.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation. Working in the pharmaceutical industry, my question is if there can be also on country level, public-private, collaboration between Cienzano, the National Health Institute, and the industry, because actually the industry also needs the data to respond to the requirements for having reimbursement of the products. And it would be better if every company then uses the same data because we're working in the same population.
Yeah, I think it's been touched upon as well during the yesterday. I think it's a really complex issue because indeed you don't want to duplicate efforts, and if the data is there, it should be used. With COVID, we have a lot of open data that is there, but it only has a certain granularity. And then because there is this law on accessibility or transparency of information, people can also put in data requests and have access to more detailed information. And as long as it's not identifiable, that would then probably be granted. So we had quite a few demands from pharmaceutical companies, actually, because the vaccine registry worked so nicely that there's a lot of potential in it. And we're not unwilling to give that data, and we did in certain instances. But then it also becomes a resource issue because, you can fill in timesheets and then ask them to pay for the time you do to do this additional analysis. But even that becomes tricky, I guess, because within Cienzano, and I don't know where the colleagues are, we also have a service that's the quality of vaccinations monitoring. I'm sorry, I don't know what these official names are, but that do the independent testing of all the batches all the vaccine batches that are released onto the market. And so you really, really want to avoid, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that there is any payment of pharmacy going to the Public Health Institute that's also approving these badges. And perception is also an important thing, right? It's not about a real conflict of interest, it's about perceived conflicts of interest. And so I'm not sure on this question that has been raised a few times now, like should then the Public Health Institutes be doing this both post-marketing surveillance, and how do we distribute it, and where then comes the funding from? Because it's a tricky one, because even though I rationally agree that it's important to collaborate, etc., vaccine hesitancy is also a thing, and so you really want to make sure that you're perceived as independent and not being paid by pharma for your results.
Liz, do you want to say something? No, okay, because I mean it is maybe done at some other public health institutes, such collaborations. It can be done. It is been done. So maybe it's something to consider for the future. But
well, it might be done. But ECDC EMA, like last year, founded the vaccine monitoring platform, where they very explicitly state that it needs to be industry independent because they feel it's necessary for public confidence to avoid any. Any doubts about industry involvement. So, yeah, maybe it's done by other public health institutes, but I don't think that it's so broadly accepted or such a consensus that this is the way forward. I think there's the two schools, that there's also those that say that it's very important to not have any payment, and I'm not sure where to position.
Yep, I'm aware. I'm quite well aware of these sensitivities, I assume. Let me introduce the next speaker, who also knows very well about all these sensitivities from our colleagues at ECDC. So, Laurence Pagnon, she's an epidemiologist working at Sanofi currently for many years, already working on international projects, trying to foster public-private partnerships, so trying to make sure that public health organizations can work together with private partners, including vaccine companies. For many years, we are trying to achieve this, but it's not that easy. We recognize this. Laurence, up to you now.
Thank you, Kat. Yeah, it's a sensitive topic. We have made some good progress, but yeah, we have to acknowledge that we are not yet there, even if, so there is still discussion on it, and it's part of my presentation, in fact. So I'm really happy to be with you. We had really very fantastic presentation before, and a really nice discussion at the breakout session. So I really enjoyed this meeting. So I'm really the last talk. So I hope you still have some energy to listen and to follow what I'm going to present. So it's not about Belgium, sorry. This talk is, it's more on the high-level topics that we tackled for the conference. It's how we can improve quality of evidence for decision-making. And I'm just going to share two proof of concepts projects that we have been involved with colleagues. So it's a team presentation from Sanofi, but as you can see, it's a very collaborative effort. So I'm going to present two proof of concept. One is Dan-Flu-1, and there is a huge team behind and a lot of institutions involved along with Sanofi. And the DRIVE project, where a lot of people in this room has been also engaged with so many partners. So I will not spend too much time on the introduction because a lot have been said already previously, but we all observe that the digital expansion in healthcare offer a lot of possibility to generate real-world evidence. And that's very important for assessing vaccine usage and performance, which is obviously, and we all agree on that, complementing evidence for randomized clinical trial. So while that's obvious that real-world evidence has been really largely used for safety, we had a lot of discussion today on the vaccine effectiveness piece, because this is where we have more, discussion on the bias, confounder, and that's where we observe maybe much more challenge in the acceptance of the observational design and how we can generate evidence. So the specific, the two proof of concept studies that I'm going to detail are really focused on influenza vaccine effectiveness. So as you know, influenza vaccination, vaccine performance vary across season with the different virus circulation and the strain selection in the vaccine, obviously the population, the setting, and the outcomes. Then while in a clinical trial, it's accepted as gold standard. There is, of course, this limitation in terms of population, in terms of course, various medical conditions, and of course, it's limiting a lot what you are assessing in terms of clinical outcome and the number of the season that you are tackling. So the other huge limitation that we have observed is that when you assess influenza vaccine effectiveness in countries or regions, you have these enormous differences in policy, in coverage, in uptakes, and in vaccine types. So that's becoming almost a nightmare to set up some study. And that really underscores the need for innovative and fit-for-purpose real-world evidence platforms to produce robust vaccine performance estimates. So here we are. So that's the two proof of concept that I would like to just briefly present that have the same goal, but that really very different angle and very different way to approach them. So the first one is DAN-Flu1. So the objective is really to assess the relative vaccine effectiveness of high dose versus standard dose influenza vaccination against a broader clinically meaningful endpoints. So the idea is really to confirm findings from previous observational research. So this led for an approach where we have proposed a randomized real-world study. So there is various language use. So you can say hybrid model or pragmatic randomized trial, but whatever the wording is that I will explain later, we are mixing randomization with real-world follow-up. This has been sponsored by the University Hospital of Copenhagen in Denmark with Sanofi as a collaborator. And this has been done during the season 21-22. And then the other proof of concept study is the one that some of you are well familiar. This is the objective was really to assess the brand-specific absolute vaccine effectiveness of influenza vaccination across season in EU country and against lab-confirmed influenza. So the objective was really to fulfill regulatory obligation. And then in DRIVE, what we did is a test negative and cohort real-world study. It was done through a collaborative real-world platform between several public health institutes, academia, and also vaccine companies. And it was a pan-European across 4-season project. So let's start with DAN-Flu1. So as we briefly said before, the idea is really to use the component that we have in clinical trials, so the randomization. And what is also the beauty of the observational study is the follow-up in real-world data. So the idea is to mix the two of them to set up a new, I will say, design, an hybrid model that gives you the value of the randomization and then the possibility to have a broader population and to follow up clinical outcome. So the objective of DAN-Flu1 was really to evaluate the feasibility. So it's really a feasibility study. The idea is to look at the integrating individual randomization into routine seasonal influenza vaccination practice and using administrative health registry for collection of both baseline outcome and safety data. So I'm not going to tackle the safety piece, but it was part of the study. So how we did it? So during the season 21-22, so the inclusion, randomization, and vaccination was done by a private vaccination provider. And so it was, so it's a pragmatic open label, individually randomized feasibility study. And then all the inclusion criteria, so was the people aged from 64 to 79 years. And of course with informed consent. And they were, randomized as a 1:1 ratio. So you have the QIV high dose and the QIV standard dose for the two groups. And then the study oversight and the database management was done by the hospital in Copenhagen. And they have access to the national-wide system that allow to get access to the registry and to have the follow-up of all the clinical outcomes from the participant. So the data collection was really on collecting baseline characteristic and clinical outcome from observationally the Danish National Registries. So it started on day 14, which is, the usual start after vaccination and to have the immunization. And then it ended by end of May. So what we can present as a feasibility result is the following. So first, we have been enrolled in total 34,000 persons, so has been proposed to be invited. We have 40% that consented and were randomized at the end in the study. And among of them, the ratio between the two groups were well balanced. Then we also have a good, I will say, procedure in place. And even if we have some lesson learned to help improving, the recruitment and the consent in the future study, it demonstrates that the procedure went well and the recruitment volume is feasible. The second piece was really the comparability of the two groups, which is very important, and the reason why also you put the randomization. And when looking at the baseline characteristic and also the comparison to the overall Danish population, we saw that and we concluded that the randomization was really effective, and the result could be generalizable to this, of course, age range for the population. And finally, even if the study was not designed and powered to really have, a true comparative vaccine effectiveness, the idea was really to have some description of the event rates in the two groups to see if it's feasible for a more powerful study to follow up afterwards. So what we have observed is that the findings of the lower incidence on PNI hospitalization in the high dose versus standard dose group is something that, of course, needs to be confirmed in the future, but show a good trend. So, of course, there is a limitation to this study design, even if we try to pick up the best component of each piece. So the study, as I said, was not powered to assess clinical outcomes, and that's what we will do and are starting to do for the true study. There is also this thing that as we use this system in place, we did not necessarily confirm systematically with influenza testing result. So it was not performed, even if that's something that could be done with the Danish system, it was not done in the feasibility study. The trial was open label, so it means that it's not blinded. But we still think that with this, hospitalization outcome, it's not necessarily a huge bias to have open label. And then, as a limitation of using, administrative health data, we do not use adjudication of the clinical outcome, but that's something that has been also previously discussed in the literature, and we think that that's something that we can move forward. So just to conclude on den flu, so we succeed having this pragmatic randomized study as a feasibility step done, and it confirms that it's feasible. Now we are in the process of conducting the fully powered study, and we have starting already this study in Denmark. So just briefly on DRIVE, which is the other proof of concept. So in 2016, EMA requested company to monitor brand-specific influenza vaccine effectiveness and to liaise with public health institute as part of company regulatory obligation. So we all acknowledge that it's a substantial challenge that needs to be tackled all together. So multi-stakeholder approach. And through the Innovative Medicine Initiative, its proof of concept has been set up to address this regulatory requirements. So it was quite a unique, I will say, proof of concept from IMI, because usually it's more on the R&D piece. But here, mixing post-authorization with regulatory environment was quite a challenge. So just briefly, the objective of this project was to really first set up a sustainable study network for brand-specific influenza vaccine study in Europe. And as we previously tackled, to really also find a governance model that allow to have public and private together and to have transparent and trusted results coming out from this PPP. So so each year, what we were asked is to submit a joint report to EMA in order to present the absolute brand-specific influenza vaccine effectiveness from the company engaged in DRIVE, and to present that as a consortium joint report. So we had a lot of work packages, and we had a lot of activities and deliverables, so I will not spend too much time on that. But just to make it more straightforward, what has been the key piece and the methods piece. So for the study platform, we really try to engage as much as possible the Public Health Institute, because the value is really to leverage what is existing already at the national and regional level. And we also develop a public call for tender to select the site and to make sure that we are filling the gap based on this public call. We've, of course, developed a master generic protocol to make sure that sites are doing in the same way the data collection. A pool analysis has been proposed, and of course, upfront, some mock report has been established in order to really accelerate, the time between when you get the data and when you propose the data or share the data with EMA. So we have worked on that. The idea was really to, between public and private, to agree on the methods and to agree on what we would like to put on the report before the data come, and then when the data are there, the company are out, in order to ensure this independency. And of course, all the GDPR infrastructure behind that. So then we build on also a joint interest, shared decision-making, joint funding that was offered by IMI Umbrella that help a lot. And we work on some governance model to really find a way to share the role and responsibility and really find the good, I will say, balance in order to ensure we appropriately address perception of conflict of interest. And we had several surveys and workshops along the 5 years to test governance. And finally, which was very important, so EMA was at the start of this project, and they follow us all along the 5 years, and we still have some discussion 2 years after. And really, it was really great for this project because we were engaged with them since the start, and it's allowed us to really discuss on what are their expectations in terms of reporting, in terms of robustness, in terms of targeted population, and so on. And we had also a national scientific advice with the PEI. So the result is that we came out with a very nice platform at the end, which was quite agile, efficient, and cost-effective, with several sites in Europe covering, quite a good population. We had also this good relationship and trust that has been built along the 5 years. And we had, in terms of expectation for the joint report, we have cover, so for the season just before the pandemic arrived, we had really very good, precise brand-specific estimate that has been produced thanks to all the efforts made. And at the end of the project, we cover 8 out of the 12 influenza vaccine used in Europe, which is quite not so bad. And we had this joint report, which was not a given at the start, but then it was evaluated by the Vaccine Working Party each year. So just to conclude, to wrap up on the limitation before the conclusion. So despite all the energy we put to also try to really keep it, I will say, reasonable in terms of platform, we really try to discuss with IMA and to focus on population with highest disease burden of influenza, to have relative high vaccine coverage, and to adjust also the pooling of the data. Still, it remains a big challenge to get precise estimate per brand for really informed decision making. So IMA at the end said that it's not sufficient for decision making because they were expected to have this minimum of 3 years of data that was not necessarily achieved at the end of the project. Also, with the pandemic arriving not at the good time. But anyway, so it was one of the big limitations of the platform. And then, of course, this public-private partnership hesitancy that is still a question to be tackled in the future, that remain an obstacle really to scale up the project at the end of the 5 years. So as a conclusion, this platform was really unique because it really proposed consistently brand-specific influenza vaccine effectiveness each season for the European region. It was really a successful proof of concept, but that deserves more, I will say, political discussion and clarity in stakeholder role and responsibility in the vaccine monitoring environment. So that's where we are currently. So just to conclude this presentation, so it's just to give 2 proof of concept that offer, we think, promising solution to try to really improve the quality of the real-world evidence. So there are different approach and fit for purpose model, but of course it's the start, and implementation and acceptance warrant further step and multi-stakeholder discussion to move to actionable decision making. And I would like just to reference for the 2 proof of concept. There is of course much more detail on papers. And I would like to thank all the people that have been engaged in those 2 proof of concept projects. Thank you.
Okay. Still someone energy for questions, of course, please.
The randomization, individual level randomization with, patient consent, you've got to have dedicated staff. I mean, that's a clinical trial upfront recruitment process. How are you going to do that for 273,000 people? Or are you going to drop the route? Are you going to have another simpler process for randomization?
So it was done by the vaccination provider center. So it was organized at that level. But
to get informed consent, you've got to have information leaflet.
Yeah.
You've got to have somebody taking the consent.
Yeah.
You've got to have individual randomization lists. I mean, that's quite a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a huge work at the start.
Yes.
But then with the follow-up, it's leverage.
Yeah, the follow-up
Yeah.
relies on. I was just wondering that
The
this.
other alternative is to have this cluster randomization. That
Yeah.
would be also another way to I will say maybe have a easier model in pragmatic trial. So there is other studies that are using a cluster randomized project. We have done one in the US. So it's a balance of benefit and effort that you put there. But it's a huge effort.
And the second question: given the failure of many big public health institutions to buy into the DRIVE model, and given the implications that had for power, how are you going to, in future, meet your regulatory requirements for EMA? Or maybe you'll stop making vaccines? I don't know.
So we had a discussion with EMA very recently because just after the end of DRIVE, we had this presentation of the proof of concept, and we said to EMA, we have done the job collectively. Now it's not at our level that we can change the things. They proposed us a 1-year deferral. So we did not provided any brand-specific EVE for the season just after DRIVE. And we had another meeting with them, and they just confirmed the deferral for this season 23-24 because they are not yet there with the discussion with ECDC. So they fully acknowledge that DRIVE is work well. They, I think, well understood that we put a lot of energy behind that all together. But then they know that the way to solve that, it's not our level. That should be at the much European Commission level, even I think higher than EMA and ECDC, who are not necessarily fully aligned together. So we have 1 year deferral more, and then still a question mark for the future. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I liked the experience of DRIVE. I think it was a very good thing. In regard to the, let's call it pragmatic trial, the first thing, I assume the group individually randomized, and it was double-blind, meaning the providers and the vaccinees did not know who received vaccine and who received, vaccine 1 and who received vaccine 2. That's the first part of the question. I assume this is...
No, it's open label, so they know.
Okay, then I would, at the very least, use negative outcomes, and we can discuss that, offline if you want, but I would not trust an open level study such as this upfront without some verification. I don't want to waste.
But I can provide much more detail. I was not the one deeply engaged in this pragmatic trial, but I can address your question.
Right, the age of the outcomes were not confirmed. It was a time in which circulation of influenza was not so substantial. The other thing is, unhappily, you only use 65 to 79. I would like to see an age effect, and I'd like to see people of 80 and over included. And I like some negative outcomes. But anyway,
there is a lot of expectation behind it. So just for the age, it was also linked to the recommendation of the Danish population. If you go above, it's high dose that is recommended. So we cannot have this randomization with standard dose. So that's why we did not go above this age for because we are using the national vaccination program, and then for the other things, in Become Umbrella we just discussed that we need to have follow-up discussion on the pragmatic trial and the methods behind that, because I think that the start that there is a lot of things that need to be discussed further on how to address the best and how to mix randomization and real world follow-up. But yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
But, yeah, if you do your follow-up on databases, having a negative outcome can't be too difficult, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, but I'm taking the point. And
Any other questions? No, then I think it's time for a closure. Joris?
So, thank you, Kat, and thank you all for staying so long this afternoon. So, first, some practical points. You will all receive a request for evaluation of these 2 days meetings. Madi, I think this comes by the website or this comes by mail. Sorry. Oh, yes. There is the QR code. Okay, thank you. So, secondly, as mentioned already many times today, there will be a meeting report, and we will see how far we advanced, and I think Kat will be the master of that report, together with P95, which is an excellent group. We have a long experience on publications and reports with P95 on all our congresses, so the quality is already assured in advance. So the report will, of course, the draft will be shared with the session chairs and with all the people who played an important role in this 2 days event. I like to thank particularly our main partner, Flanders Vaccines, with whom we went through a very happy and sometimes quite stressing times, but we made it. Thanks a lot, Fran, and your organization. And I like to thank our sponsors, so CEPI, who supported us from the beginning, Sanofi, AstraZeneca, and last but not least, P95. And I like a special warm thank to Fran from Flanders Vaccines, to Madi, and to Marlene in the back. Can we have a small applause for this perfect support and the logistics for such a meeting? We cannot underestimate the importance of that, and especially when it then all fits well and all falls into the right place, then we are all very happy. If you are a member of IABS, probably you know that, if you are a member of IABS, you have access to the website, and then you have access to all the presentations from all over previous conferences. This goes back quite a couple of years already. So I can just encourage you to become member of IABS if you want to in the next 3 months or 6 months. What were the presentations from the Real-World Evidence Conference? Now on real-world evidence, I will try to mention some key points. I know it's a risky exercise after these 2 days discussions. So I think we can all agree that real-world evidence is, I would call it, a gold mine of information on safety and on efficacy. We have seen many examples of that. However, we all agree that there are many challenges ahead. And we would say that we are just at the beginning. So there have been, you have had this, some of you, this conference in Les Pensières. We have this one. And I have the strong feeling there is a need for follow-up. Why not in 2024? But if we have to do that, normally for a successful meeting, you need on average 1 year preparation. So we also heard that it's very important to look at it globally. And the challenges ahead, I just only cite some of them which seem to me very important. It's a question of harmonization, the capacity issue, particularly in low and middle income countries, because by definition we can expect that these infectious diseases, they do not know borders. Unfortunately, some decision makers have to be reminded to that. There is the big issue of infrastructure, also again in low and middle income countries. And on the other hand, we should not underestimate in so low and middle income countries, we have already quite high capacity. So we should try to work better with them together. Then there is the whole discussion about the phase 3. So we heard quite a lot of arguments, and I try to remember what Jacob told us yesterday or this morning. So if we had correlates of protection or surrogate or something that gives a good immunogenetic response where the specialists are comfortable with, particularly in case of an urgency, why can't we use that and immediately go to the vaccinations where it is needed and then count on the real-world evidence? Anyway, the phase 3, it seems very difficult when we talk about Crimean hemorrhagic fever, for example, Lassa, and some rare diseases. So there are still a lot of open questions that we really need to answer. And the best way probably to answer that is that we convene to see each other again, probably next year. It will depend on you if there is a demand in order to progress on what we will conclude and we will write following this meeting. Having said all that, again, warm thanks to be here, and I wish all of you a very good travel back. Some of you have a long travel, isn't it, Hector? And again, many thanks to have stayed here until the last second. Thanks a lot.